Dr. Moore said that she is a Methodist preacher influenced by the Baptist. Well, I'm a Methodist preacher, and I married a Presbyterian preacher. So I have learned to be brief. But also as a Methodist, I have learned that I'm going to speak about whatever I will decide to speak. I say that because the title that has been given there in your program is not what I'm going to talk about. Doesn't matter, I've written many books and the title doesn't say what the book is about either. Hace años, un amigo mío, profesor de la Universidad de Puerto Rico, vino a los Estados Unidos a hablar a un grupo de educadores distinguidos. Some years ago, a friend of mine, a professor at the University of Puerto Rico, came to the United States to speak to a group of very distinguished educators. Y el tema era la educación para los desaventajados culturalmente. And the subject was the education for the culturally deprived. He was introduced with all this sort of thing, some truth and some lies, like like Juan just did for me. Lo presentaron con mucha bombo y platillo, and he stood up, se puso de pie, and he began speaking. Empezó a hablar. Damas y caballeros. He started speaking Spanish. And everybody started looking around, what's going on? And he kept on going and going, and everybody started getting nervous. And finally, the chair of the movement came over and began sort of talking to him. And then he said, now that we have established who's culturally deprived, we shall proceed. Ahora que sabemos quiénes son los desaventajados. So out of the goodness of my Latino heart, but, I am going to speak in the language of the culturally deprived. Voy a hablar en el lenguaje de los desaventajados culturalmente. It's a pleasure to be here with you. It's a pleasure for many reasons. It is a pleasure because even from afar and from the very beginning, I have watched the Latino, first of all, the Hispanic program and the Latino Center grow. It is a pleasure because even though most of you will not remember it, I was invited to speak here on the 35th anniversary 5 years ago. Y el tema and the subject that gave me was the importance of the Latino church. For a moment, for some time, I considered speaking about bringing the same speech again to test your memory. But then I realized I didn't remember it either. And I rejoice also because for all of this time I have been following the development of the program, a little bit from the margin, from afar, but coming in and out again and again, visiting the program, seeing what was going on, and every time seeing something new, something powerful, something promising. But now, when things are so great and we have all these things going, why spend time talking about the last 40 years? Why look back when there's so much to look forward to? Why talk about something that happened 40 years ago when electric typewriters were a marvel and today they are museum pieces? Why speak about what happened 40 years ago when the smartphone that I bought, well, I didn't want to buy one. I didn't want to have a phone that was smarter than I was, but eventually I gave up. And the phone that I bought a year ago is already obsolete. And then as I was preparing, thinking about this, I saw a comic strip, Pearls Before Swine. And here is Piglet, and this other guy is introducing himself to him, and he says, I'm your neighbor, I came to see you. But he's got his back to him. And Piglet says, but why are you turning the other way around? He says, well, you see, I'm a historian. I always look at things backward. And that immediately brought to my mind a comment that my mother made once. My brother was a professor of Old Testament. I was teaching, as you know, church history. And my mother said, when are you guys going to study somebody who's alive? At that point, I really didn't know what to say. But today, I think I could answer along 3 different lines. First of all, pulling back to my Hispanic roots, I will go back and quote that famous Spanish philosophy of the last century, José Ortega y Gasset, who said, para comprender algo humano, personal o colectivo, es preciso contar una historia. In order to understand something human, no matter whether individual or collective, one has to tell a story. Or as he would say elsewhere, every generation stands on the shoulders of the generations before them. In other words, to understand the Latino Center and what's going on and the programs of the future, it is not enough to just look at what it is today. It is not to look at its present programs that its founders probably would never have dreamt of. It is not enough to look at its plans for the future, plans that deserve, obviously, the support of the entire Fuller community as well as the Latino community. We must look back to the early days, to the challenges the program faced, to the dreams of the founders, to dreams realized and dreams thwarted. We are to understand the Latino Center today. We must go back, way back, perhaps to 1964, when the Hispanic American Baptist Seminary was closed, as we heard before. We go back to Dr. Jose Arreguin, Eduardo Font. Where are you, Eduardo? Eduardo Font, and others, many others who would not let the dream, a difficult dream at that point, by the way, would not let it die. I must go back to a conversation that I had with Jorge Gay back in San Jose before he came to this country back, where he was telling me about the dream that he had to be able to come to the United States in order to train leaders for both the U.S. Latino Church and the church in Latin America. Must go back to another conversation I had with Dr. Isaac Canales, who has been mentioned here before. Before he was a professor, before he was beginning his students, and he came to talk to me about his dreams to get a PhD in New Testament and be able to teach his people. We must go back to Clifton Holland's study about the churches in this area that were very much at the background of the decisions that Fuller took in order to move in the directions that took them to what they are today. Now, things have changed. What began in 1974 as a Hispanic program whose purpose was to provide a basic certificate to pastors who had not been able to study much is now the Center for the Hispanic Church, for the study of the Hispanic Church and Community, Centro para el Estudio de la Iglesia y Comunidad Latinas. What used to give only a certificate now has 2- and 3-year master programs. It has a doctorate program also. And what has now taken place of that emphasis in the certificates is the support that Fuller now gives by helping, by leading people who are teaching at that level all through the area, and many of you know that better than I do. What was once limited to Los Angeles, we already heard, now has extensions in the Bay Area and in Texas, and there's a third one just beginning to take shape. But even so, even in spite of all those changes, today's Centro Latino stands on the shoulders of those people I have mentioned before and many others whose names are unknown. We may be very enthused about what we're doing, and we should be, about our plans for the future, about the new programs, about entering students, the tremendous statistics we just heard. All of that is great. But all of that is possible only because we stand on the shoulders of those who dreamed before we dreamed, who labored before we labored, who sacrificed so that today we can celebrate this 40th anniversary. Secondly, I would say to my mother, remember my mother asked me about somebody who was alive? I would say to my mother, you remember what Jesus said? ¿No habéis leído en el libro de Moisés cómo le habló Dios en la zarza diciendo, yo soy el Dios de Abraham, el Dios de Isaac y el Dios de Jacob? Dios no es Dios de muertos, sino de vivos. I read it in Spanish first because, don't believe what the New Testament people tell you, okay? And the Old Testament, no. The Bible was originally written in Spanish. Yeah. You see, God translated it into Hebrew and Greek because nobody knew Spanish yet. But anyhow, what I was reading in answer to my mother now would be the words of Jesus. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Our God is not a God of the dead, but a God of the living. Our God is the God not only of Jacob and of Isaac and Rebekah, is also the God of Jose Arreguin and Jorge Gay and many other, those already in high numbers of the very first graduates of this program who are no longer with us. If we believe that we all shall live in God, we must also believe that they too live in God. And if they live in God, they are now our brothers and sisters whom we must cherish and respect just as we do our brothers and sisters of today. Times have changed. Many of the early witnesses to the work of the Centro Latino, most of the early leaders, and many of his first alumni have now passed to the presence of God to join Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and his family and the great cloud of witnesses. You see, we may forget, but our God does not forget. The God of Isaac of Abraham and Sarah, of Isaac and Rachel, and the God of Jacob and Rebekah, the living God of the living, is a God who does not forget. And because God does not forget, it behooves us also not to forget. Today, we celebrate the 40 years of the Centro Latino. Thirdly, I will say to my mother, because our God is a God of mighty deeds. At the end of Deuteronomy, we are told that after giving the law, Moses sang on the hearing of the whole assembly of Israel. Cantó Moisés. Acuérdate de los tiempos antiguos, considera los años de muchas generaciones, pregunta a tu padre y él te lo contará, a tus ancianos y ellos te dirán. Remember the days of old, consider the years long past, Ask your father, and he will inform you, your elders, and they will tell you. The rest of the Song of Moses tells of the mighty acts of God that the children of God are to remember. He sustained them in the desert land, in a howling wilderness waste. He shielded them, cared for them, guarding him as the apple of his eye, as an eagle stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, as it spreads its wings, takes them up, and bears them aloft in its pinions. The Lord God alone guided him. Le halló en tierra del desierto, en yermo de horrible soledad, le rodeó, le instruyó, le guardó como a la niña de su ojo, como el águila que excita su nidada revoloteando sobre sus pollos, así extendió sus alas, lo tomó y lo llevó sobre sus plumas. Israel is to obey God because Israel is to remember the mighty acts of God. Israel knows God as the one who freed the people from the yoke of Egypt. Israel knows God as the one who in the beginning made the heavens and the earth. Israel knows God as the one who called Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldeans. And as time goes by, Israel will keep on adding other elements, other stories of what God has done with them. God is the God who dried the river Jordan and thus opened the way into a new land that flows milk and honey. God is the one who gave David the victory over the giant. When Israel was in Babylon, it was God who made a highway in the desert. Because God is a mighty God who intervenes in the history of the people of God. To know God is to remember the mighty acts of God. And to forget those mighty acts is to forget the God who performed them. So when we forget history, when we forget these 40 years that we're talking about, we are not just forgetting the names of those sisters and brothers I was talking about. We are also forgetting the very God who led them through the wilderness and across into the promised land and to a new future. And so, as we today come to the 40th anniversary of the founding of the Centro Latino, the words of Moses still come to us as a word from God. Remember the days of old. Consider the years long past. Ask your parents, and they will inform you, and your elders, and they will tell you. Acuérdate de los tiempos antiguos. Considera los años de muchas generaciones. Pregunta a tu padre, y él te contará, a tus ancianos, y ellos te dirán. Remember that the God who led Egypt in the desert is also the God who accompanied many of our people across the desert. And I'm talking literally. Remember that the God who opened the Jordan so they could cross dry shod is the same God who accompanied them when they crossed the river and their backs were wet. Remember that the God who led the people out of exile into the new freedom is the same God who's calling and leading our people into new and greater freedoms. Remember that the God who brought down the walls of Jericho and who in Jesus Christ brought down every wall of separation is the same God who brought down the many walls. And there were many. I lived with some of them through them, the many walls that the founders of the Centro and the first students had to face. Remember that the God who went ahead of Israel in the cloud, in the pillar of fire, is the same God who has gone ahead of us in Jesus Christ, who from the right hand of God calls us into the future. So today, as we look to the future, let's look at a future that is not in doubt. See, there's one thing of which we can be sure, is that this God whom we remember, this God who brought our ancestors in the faith out of the land of Egypt, this God who brought our ancestors from whatever land we came to this land, this God who tore down the walls that made it so difficult for the Hispanic program to take its first steps, this God is still with us. And you know that God is only still with us, that God is also ahead of us. In the desert, God does not push Israel to go places. God goes ahead of Israel in the pillar and in the cloud. And so what we are to do today as we celebrate those 40 years is by looking back at that and knowing who our God is and knowing what our God has done, asking, God, where are you now waiting for us? What are you now calling us to do? And how can we join you in that crossing where you once again, are opening the waters and bringing down the barriers, the walls. Remember the past, because without it, you cannot march into the future. Remember the past, because it's that past that gives us some hint as to the future from which God is calling us. And be faithful to that past by helping this institution and this program to move towards that future in the hands of that God. Remember, remember, remember. Amen.